Well, it's my pleasure to be with you guys. My name is Tim Barton. I'm the president of WallBuilders, and like Congressman or Dean Bachman said, we usually spend a lot of time talking about the spiritual heritage of the nation. I want to highlight something maybe a little different for us this morning, but it's going to have a very similar foundation. It's looking at where we are now, and I'm going to have a bunch of slides. Hopefully in a minute I'll be able to show you guys as we go. For those that paid attention to anything on social media or the news, do we have? Oh, good. Charlie Kirk, when he was assassinated a couple weeks ago, there was a lot of remarkable things that happened from it, not the least of which, the largest church service we've ever seen in our lifetime took place. If you did not see some of what happened there, it was amazing the gospel presentations that were given. There was 3 hours of worship to start the day off by very noted worship leaders. And then, of course, when Erica Kirk, who her husband had been murdered, gets up and says that she forgives the murderer, one of the most amazing displays of what the gospel is all about, the love, the forgiveness, so many incredible things. But what's interesting about this is also since that time, there's been an increase in church attendance. In fact, pastors have identified about a 15% increase in church attendance throughout the nation that's happened, where people are going back to church. And it's not just people going to church, it's largely young people that are going to church, that are discovering things that were new for them in this whole faith idea. And the reason part of this matters, and I want to kind of land this plane on this idea real quick. There have been people that have been praying for revival longer than you've been alive. Okay, and I'm saying that, I don't care how old you are in the room. They've been praying for revival for hundreds of years, so that covers all of us. They've been praying for revival forever, but there have been times that we can track in history and go, you know what, I think God is moving. This might be a revival, and if we look at where we are today, I think it's worth asking the question, are we seeing a revival in America? Because if it does, what does that mean for us? What should we be doing? And this is where I want to spend some time talking this morning. This idea, are we seeing a revival? As I mentioned, not just from Charlie Kirk, earlier in the year, there were the highest recorded church attendance from Easter. We can point out that Bible sales right now are soaring in America and in the UK. In fact, I think it was in August alone, more than 10 million Bibles sold to people that had not bought Bibles before, which is also kind of crazy to think that in America there's a lot of people that still don't have Bibles. There are also revivals over the last 2 or 3 years that have been all over college campuses. And this is something that a lot of people might not have paid attention to. Obviously, you're at a Christian university, so this is not surprising for you guys to think that maybe God is moving in the hearts and minds of young people. But if you look at Ohio State as an example, earlier this year, 2,000 students responded to the gospel at Ohio State. At Mississippi State, 6,000 people showed up at a revival. At Purdue University, 4,500 students. At the Florida State University, which is considered one of the top party schools in the nation, they have God moving. That fountain, they actually had baptismals in that fountain as God was moving on campus. The University of Florida had 6,000 people gather. Also similar, if you look at West Virginia University, they had 5,000 students show up. Nearly 1,000 students responded to the altar call. The University of Tennessee has thousands showing up. The same thing at the University of Georgia. The same thing at the University of South Florida. Also at Texas A&M, more than 10,000 students gathered to sing praise and worship, and a lot of dedications there. The same thing at the University of Oklahoma, where thousands of students are showing up. The same thing at the University of Arkansas. Thousands of students are showing up. Now, this is over the last 2 years. And so this is not something where some people are looking at what happened to Charlie Kirk and man, God is stirring and moving, and he is. But God didn't just start stirring and moving. God's been on the move in our nation in a very unique way for a while, especially for the rising and younger generation, which along those lines, there's actually new data out now, which is quite interesting, that right now, the highest church attendance rates in America are from Gen Z. Not from old people, right? No, it's the younger generation. It is your generation. The highest rates of church attendance are young people. And by the way, it's by the Gen Z males. The young men are going to church at rates we've never seen before. And this is one of many things that, again, raises the question, is what we're seeing right now a revival in America? And I would say, based on the data we can track very well throughout the nation and lots of events, I think we are unquestionably in the midst of a revival. Now, this is something that we should celebrate, that God is on the move in really unique ways. But one of the things that we want to do is we want to ask some questions and look back historically, because in America, there have been a lot of major revivals in American history. And here's a question we should ask with revivals. Do revivals impact the culture? Right? If God is moving in significant ways, does it make a difference in that nation? And the question is absolutely, but not always. Okay? If you go back and look at the revivals, what happens? 1730s, easy one, because this was known as like the First Great Awakening. Okay, in the 1730s, going on for 30, 40 years, depending on that time frame. Different historians have different ideas about how long it went. But then you have in the 1790s, what's generally known as the Second Great Awakening. And this goes on through kind of the earlier 1800s. Some people think in 1830 is when you had the Third Great Awakening. Some people say, nope, Second Great Awakening is still going on, but God was doing a fresh new pouring out in the 1830s. In the 1850s, you had prayer revivals. During the Civil War, there were revivals in camps. They had, in both the Union and Confederate camps, there were revivals, people being saved, dramatic things happening in those revivals. And if we go forward, when you get to 1870, there were many more revivals, but what were known as like the urban revivals. You have D.L. Moody, very noted guy, John Wanamaker, a lot of big important names from that time. When you get to the 1900s, again, more of the urban revivals. This is where you have Billy Sunday, big, huge tent crusade revivals. And if you even come forward to the 1970s, when you have the Jesus movement, there was a really great film about this not long ago that came out, really great, well done. But in the Jesus Revolution, there have been so many revivals in the nation. And so again, this is where we would ask the question, if you track all those revivals, did those revivals make a difference in the culture? And this is interesting because it's not always. Some of them did, and some of them didn't. Now, why does this matter? Because if we look and we recognize today that God is moving, and maybe there's a revival in our nation, and I think there is, then we ought to go, okay, so what made the difference in revivals that impacted the nation? And what made a difference in revivals that didn't really seem to impact the nation? And let me unfold this further for you, because I don't want us to think, I don't want to misrepresent. When God is moving, it is always a good thing. But sometimes people respond differently, and sometimes the way that we respond to what God does, we're sometimes leaving out some important details and aspects of what we should be doing. Let me track this for a second. So if you look at some of the more recent revivals in American history, again, these are very, very important noted revivals where tens of millions of people came to Christ during these revivals. So incredibly impactful in American history. But also, if you look over that roughly 100-year period where there were these revivals taking place, there were several other things taking place as well. This was the rise of what was known as the progressive era. Now, under the progressive era, there's a lot of things that happened, but one of the easy things we can point to is educationally. This is when you have the rise of Darwinian evolution being taught in academia. Okay, now, track with us for a second. Jesus is moving in amazing ways, and in the midst of Jesus moving in amazing ways, culture starts embracing Darwin evolution. Now, again, it's kind of interesting because you can go to the Scopes monkey trials where they were literally debating about whether you could teach creation or evolution in schools. And the court ruled and said, you know what? No, it really should be creation being taught. And yet it didn't stop what was going on. Also, you have people like Margaret Sanger, who's coming on the scene, and she's promoting a eugenics movement. And in the midst of her promoting this eugenics movement, a couple of things about this. There were 28 states at that time that adopted eugenics laws. And in eugenics laws, it dealt with sterilization and reproduction and marriage and sex. And there was all kinds of stuff they were dealing with in these laws. Again, this is in the middle of revivals. So eugenics laws are happening. And there was a film that came out. It was called The Black Stork. Just to give you an example, this was a eugenics film that was a major production that came out. In this eugenics film, they were part of the eugenics idea is we only want the best of civilization, the healthiest, the brightest minds, what that is. And a lot of the eugenics movement, it was a very white promotion of we want the strong, healthy white people going forward. That's a lot of what the promotion was. But part of that also in the eugenics thought was if somebody has a disability, then that person is less than a human. And so in the film, it showed a family that had a child with a disability, and it showed the mom and dad navigating, what are we gonna do? And Jesus appears in the background and extends his hands, and the mom and dad euthanize, with the help of the doctor and the nurse, that means murder, the child, to give the child to Jesus, because it wouldn't really be good for that child with a disability to grow up in a world having a disability, and it's better to go ahead and kill them and send them to Jesus. Okay, this was part of the eugenics movement. Again, this is the propaganda film they're putting out, showing the best thing to do with a disability. And this is in the middle of revivals. Well, in the midst of this progressive eugenics movement also comes what was known as the Human Betterment Foundation, or the Human Betterment Society. Margaret Sanger was very connected and tied to this. The Human Betterment Society began putting out ideas of the best way to enact some of these eugenics laws and ideas. What most of us have never been taught, we've never learned, but it's very well documented. There's actually letters to the Human Betterment Foundation. And again, this is the Human Betterment Foundation. That's up top. It's going to be a little pixelated, but I'm going to put up the text so you can see this. And this is a letter back to the Human Betterment Foundation. It says, "You will be interested to know that your work has played a powerful part in shaping the opinions of the group of intellectuals who are behind Hitler in this epic-making program. Everywhere I sense that their opinions have been tremendously stimulated by American thought, particularly by the work of Human Betterment Foundation. I want you, my dear friend, to carry this thought with you for the rest of your life, that you have really jolted into action a great government of 60 million people." That's the Germans. They're saying, hey, you should be really encouraged, because guess who's getting their ideas from you? Hitler's ideas of what he did in the Holocaust, he was learning from American progressive movement in eugenics and the Human Betterment Society. Well, yes, that's correct. By the way, this is also in the era as Margaret Sanger has been doing all of this and eugenics laws have passed. She ends up finally opening up Planned Parenthood to carry out some more of this eugenics ideas. Now, again, let me remind you, in the midst of this is in the midst of some of the biggest revivals in American history, okay? There's a problem in the midst of this. If you're not seeing it already, let me keep going. If you look at higher education, over in Germany, there was the Frankfurt School. And from the Frankfurt School, this is where there was a lot of academia promotion of Marxist ideologies. Taking what Karl Marx did and then looking at Lenin and Stalin, and there was a lot of thoughts of these guys being taught in this Marxist university. And actually, this is really where critical theory first was promoted academically. Critical theory has now grown in lots of ways, and it's infected a lot of our culture in America today. Interestingly enough, how did critical theory make it to America? Well, in 1933, when Hitler came to power, Hitler actually decided that the Marxists were too dangerous for Germany, and so the Nazis drove the Marxists out of Germany, and guess where they came? They came to America, and guess where they became professors? At Columbia University. The team from Frankfurt came to Columbia and they began teaching critical theory and a lot of this Marxist ideology in America. Yeah, this is part of what happened in America. And again, this is in the midst of significant revivals. In the midst of this revival, notice what happens. Darwin and eugenics are promoted, secular progressivism, and even atheist Marxism in the midst of a major revival, or two major revivals happening in America. Well, let me come forward to the more recent one. In 1970, you have the Jesus movement. And in the midst of the Jesus movement, there are amazing things. And again, God was moving in amazing ways. Lives were being changed. The people were being healed. There was incredible stuff happening in the midst of this. The people following the movement, they were known as Jesus people. Well, in the midst of the Jesus people, the Jesus, the one-way movement, guess what other movement was on the rise and increase and overtook America? It was the sexual revolution. Now, the Jesus movement, not only did it not slow down the sexual revolution, it actually was almost like it didn't happen, because the sexual revolution grew so rapidly and quickly. By the way, the reason we have even part of like the gender revolution today, that was birthed from the sexual revolution. We are dealing with the repercussions of that today, of what happened in the midst of this. And to give you even a little clarity on how ridiculous it's become, in America, you can go to helpfulprofessors.com. And so they actually encourage all students, if you need some insight from a professor, you can go to this website, and professors offer guidance on navigating and finding answers to questions. Well, under Helpful Professors, they will tell you there's 81 types of genders and gender identities, and they list them alphabetically for you. So in case you were confused, the professors in America will give you some guidance on how many genders. Well, over in Europe, it's even worse. Over in Europe, there's global butterflies, which is a similar idea. But over in Europe, they say that there's more than 150 genders. Okay. The most recent significant, amazing revival in America. And what comes of it? We can't even identify male and female in the midst of Jesus moving in one of the most significant ways that we can track in the last multiple generations. So the question is, do revivals impact the culture? And again, we would have to look back and go, you know what? For the last many, it doesn't seem like they've really impacted the culture. In fact, in the decades after revival, the culture barely reflected any indication of positive impact. So how did the revival bring good things? Now, maybe to individuals, for sure. But did it bring good things to the nation or the culture? And this is where I think it's worth asking the question. When do revivals impact the culture? And historically looking back, we would say, well, it's when they become an awakening. That's when they impact the culture.
Now, we've had great awakenings. You guys hearing it? I thought it was not. My bad, totally my bad. So going back to great awakenings and looking at where great awakenings are, how does a revival become a great awakening? Because all the great awakenings were revivals at one point. They were revivals of religion. They were described that way. How did they become a great awakening? And there's two things that makes a difference between a revival and a great awakening. The two things, number one, it involves personal biblical discipleship. We're going to look a minute at the Great Commission. Jesus in the Great Commission did not command us to go make converts. He commanded us to make disciples. There's a big difference between being a convert and being a disciple. And so one is it involves biblical discipleship. But the second thing is the scriptures become applied to daily public living. And I'm going to give you some examples of that. So let's go back to the biblical discipleship concept. The discipleship, biblical, the concept comes out of the Great Commission, Matthew 28:18-20. In that passage, Jesus tells his disciples, as before he ascends into heaven, he says, all power is given unto me in heaven and in earth. He says, therefore go and teach all nations, baptize in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I've commanded you. So the commission, the Great Commission, is not make converts, teach them everything I've taught you. Now, what happened was in the 1870s particularly, this was seen as an evangelism mandate. Go win everybody to Jesus. Well, that's part of it, but he said, teach them everything I've taught you. So it's not all about evangelism, it's about discipleship, and that's a different thing from evangelism. And so when you look, for example, at what Jesus taught, just take Matthew 19. Matthew 19, verses 1-15, Jesus goes into the fact that there are two genders and that marriage is between a male and a female in a lifetime union. And by the way, he also covers the fact that there's no-fault divorce is wrong. Now, no-fault divorce existed back in the Hebrew culture. Jesus specifically addressed no-fault divorce. Now, I've got a lot of white hair. I'm several generations ahead of you guys. I've never in my life heard a sermon against no-fault divorce, even though Jesus gave one, and it created quite a stir when he did it, because they said, wait a minute, Moses said we could have a bill of divorcement for any reason, and Jesus said, yes, but that was not the intent of the Father. And so Jesus goes into no-fault divorce and covers that. Yeah, just like in Matthew 20, when he gets into employee and employee contracts, and the inviolability of employee contracts, or in Luke 19, where he gets into taxation policy, and you go through all the things Jesus covered. It's a whole lot more than just how to become a Christian. It is how to live in daily life, how to live in marriage, how to live with business and employees and government and so many other things. So when you look at what's there, That's what the Great Awakening got into. It was making disciples, and it covered, and to show you the type of issues it covered, at WallBuilders, we have a collection. We have about 100,000 items from Columbus all the way through the Bible, landed on the moon. So we've got lots of stuff, including tons of sermons out of these Great Awakenings and revivals. And let me take you back to some of these sermons. This is a sermon preached in the first Great Awakening by one of the greatest preachers in that Great Awakening, Jonathan Mayhew. And this is a sermon or a discourse on earthquakes. Because in November 1755, they had a big earthquake in Massachusetts. Massachusetts is not used to earthquakes. So what do we see from this earthquake? And so literally, you see the passages he's chosen there, Revelation 15, verses 3 and 4. Let's talk about earthquakes. Now, what happens with earthquakes? What is God teaching us from earthquakes? What do we need to know about earthquakes? I've never in my life heard a sermon about earthquakes, but the Bible covers earthquakes, so how come I haven't heard a sermon? And by the way, here's one by Samuel Cooper, another great preacher in the First Great Awakening, on the Great Fire in Boston. It's a tragedy they had in 1760. Well, let's deal with what's in the news right now. So what you're seeing here is whatever is in the news, it's like taking the newspaper right now and taking the headline saying, oh, here's the Bible verses that apply to that. See, natural disasters, that's part of what was there. In addition, you see this sermon on the education of youth. You know, there is no biblical precedent for secular education, which is what we have in America since we took that out of schools in 1962, 63. But churches don't want to address secular education as being wrong. There's no biblical precedent for it. There's no approval of it by God. Yeah, but there's too many of our people in church and that would offend them. No, what does the Bible say? And it deals very clearly with education, that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. You want to be smart, you start with the fear of God. It's also the beginning of wisdom. So if you want to know how to apply the knowledge, so education, here's one. Here's Religion, Patriotism, Good Soldier. This is a deployment sermon that was given in 1755 by Reverend Samuel Davies, also one of the greatest preachers in the First Great Awakening. The Bible deals so much with the military that some of our great church fathers, whether it be Augustine or St. Thomas Aquinas, have entire treatises on war. What's a just war? What's an unjust war? What's an offensive war? What's a defensive war? When is a soldier justified in killing? When is he? All of that was covered in the Scriptures, and so we covered that in the culture as well. Here's a sermon on the existence of God demonstrated in the works of creation. So creation, evolution? Yeah, even though Darwin did his stuff in 1859, the whole idea of evolution is back at the time of Aristotle. Aristotle, 500 years BC, they've already talked about the primordial slime, the Big Bang. They've talked about the intermediary species. Darwin didn't come up with something new. He just took 2,000 years of theory and made it pretty easy in a book. So we have sermons on scientific controversies that are going on. We have sermons like this. This is a relation of the medical profession to the ministry. Do you know when God gave the children of Israel the legal code he did on the mountain, a long part of it is on health codes. And he said specific things about health. That's in the Bible. Very clear. God says, hey, here's the health codes you need to have in the nation. Here's what you do with certain diseases, other things. So health care is something we covered in these sermons. Here's a sermon on the present commercial distress. This is 1837. This is called the economic panic of 1837. It's a huge collapse of the market, a huge collapse of business. And by the way, here's another sermon on the character and tendency of the property tax. Bible talks about all types of taxes. It even tells us what are good taxes and what are bad taxes. Taxes is not condemned in the Bible, but very clear on which type are good and which type are bad. So we had sermons on economics because the Bible dealt with economics. Here's a sermon on these are all going to be cultural sermons. This was preached in Virginia, 1751. This is the middle of the First Great Awakening. The sinfulness and pernicious nature of gaming. So lotteries. What Bible verse would you use to talk about lotteries? Well, we got a whole sermon on it back there. Most people don't even think about that today. Here's a good law. It's called A Sermon on the Liquor Law of Massachusetts. This is 1852. Massachusetts legislature just finished a session. In the session, they passed a law dealing with liquor consumption. And the preacher says, now, this was just passed in the legislature. What does the Bible say about this issue? So he took a legislative law and said, what's the Bible view on that? And he said, it's a good law. Based on what the Bible says about this issue, that's a good law. Here's one on the injustice and policy of the slave trade. So we're talking about current cultural issues back then. This was a big issue. The slave trade, this is a 1791 sermon, so this is also in the First Great Awakening. You know, today it would be human trafficking. And by the way, in case you're not aware, of the 193 nations in the world that we have today, 94 still have not banned slavery. There are 40 million active slaves in the world today. That's 3 times times more than we had in the 375 years of the African slave trade from 1501 to 1876. There were 12.7 million slaves in the African slave trade. We got 40 million current slaves today in the world. Nobody talking about that. Bible talks about it. So we had topics on slavery way back in the day. Here's marriage scripturally considered. This is a law that was passed in New Hampshire in 1837. Again, the legislature passed the law. What does the Bible say about it? All right, they got it right. The legislature did the right thing with this law. Here's the law. This is the Fugitive Slave Bill. This is the worst federal law ever passed in history, except maybe Roe v. Wade. Well, that wasn't a law, it was a court decision. But this Fugitive Slave Law, terrible. And so it says the higher law, and you see at the bottom it says, duties men owe to God. This is going across the nation. I have a number of these sermons. It's calling on Christians to commit civil disobedience against the federal government because that is a bad law. There's a higher law, and God's law is directly opposite to what the Congress just did. And if you're going to obey God, you have to disobey this law. There's a whole bunch of these sermons, and it led to, as you can imagine, a lot of civil disobedience and other things that went on, but it was led by the church because here's what the Bible says. So social policy, we dealt with a lot with social policy. Here's an election sermon, which means we're dealing with elections and voting. Yes, we absolutely are. Here's a sermon on the voice of warning to Christians on the ensuing election of the President of the United States. This is the 1800 election when John Adams was running against Thomas Jefferson. We have sermons on both sides. Some pastors say Jefferson's great. Some pastors say Adams is great. Doesn't matter. We didn't see anything wrong with taking what was in the news and looking at it from a biblical perspective. So we had sermons on politics. Here's a sermon on It's preached in front of John Adams and Sam Adams. So that's governor, lieutenant governor of Massachusetts. And you see it's also preached in front of the council and the Senate and the House of Representatives. So you got the entire state government together, and the preacher saying, here's what you guys need to know going into the legislative session. Here's the kind of stuff that God covers in the Bible. So we're even talking to entire legislatures. This, again, is one of those Great Awakening sermons. This is in the first and second Great Awakening time period. So all these things that we covered, this is all part of helping the Bible to be involved biblically in discipleship, helping us think through everything. That's different from revival. This is what goes on in an awakening. You start seeing how the Bible applies to every aspect of life. It's just not getting my fire insurance so that I'm not going to hell and going to be with heaven with Jesus. It's how to think the right way. And this is where the second aspect comes in, becomes part of public policy. Once you start talking this way and thinking this way, your laws start shifting, and they start reflecting that because this is what people think and believe, and it works into public policy. And so as you look at public policy specifically, these are all issues that have been raised in the last 2 years. You can choose any of those issues up there. You can choose the estate tax, the capital gains tax, the minimum wage, all those things covered in the last 2 years, and the Bible addresses every single one of them. These are all public policy issues, and if you it doesn't take long to go through the scriptures and say, yeah, the Bible does talk about that. See, this is what a great awakening is, when you can take what the Bible says and put it to every aspect of life and change the culture and change what happens. And see, this is what did not happen in the last 150 years. Since 1870, the revivals we've had since 1870, and there's been nearly 60 years of revivals, there's no indication of change in public policy in the nation. As a matter of fact, as far as the secularists are concerned, you guys have revival all you want to because it doesn't affect us. It doesn't change the culture. It doesn't change the nation in any way. They're not threatened by revivals. They're threatened by great awakenings because now you're getting into policy, and this is what makes the difference. This is what preserves literally generations. So we're in a position now where we can do that because like Tim, I'm firmly convinced we're in a revival. No question about it. But the question is, can we disciple people in the Word, and can we get that to the point where that it can literally become a great awakening? It's not enough just to have a revival. You need a great awakening because that's what impacts the culture, and that's what we had for those first 100 and some odd years. We need to get back to that, and that's based on biblical knowledge. If this stuff is new to you and this seems unusual, this is the kind of stuff we cover all the time. Again, we have this historical collection, 100,000 documents. We go back, these kind of sermons. We have this at WallBuilders.com. You'll find a lot of helpful historical resources there, books like The American Story 1 and 2, even the Founder's Bible, where we went back to the writings of the Founding Fathers and used the Bible verses they used, and we have commentary. For example, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, George Washington all pointed to Jeremiah 17:9 as the reason we have separation of powers in the Constitution. See, that's great awakening. You can take the Bible and apply it to what's going on in public life, not just to private life, but to public life. So if you're interested, you'll find that stuff there.